A humble peasant's act of kindness to a collapsed noblewoman outside his doorstep unexpectedly reveals a web of royal deception, forbidden bloodlines, and a conspiracy that threatens the kingdom's future. The discovery of a single hidden medallion brings the royal guard to his doorstep, catapulting him into a dangerous game of court politics and forcing a kingdom to confront a truth that has been buried for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the first bite of winter as James Miller stacked the last bundle of firewood outside his modest stone cottage. At 32, the broad-shouldered farmer had spent his entire life in the small village of Oakvale, nestled in the forgotten borderlands of the Kingdom of Westoria. Like his father before him and his grandfather before that, James knew the rhythms of the land, the patterns of the seasons, and little of the world beyond the surrounding hills. "That should see us through the first frost," he muttered to himself, surveying the neatly stacked woodpile. The past harvest had been lean. Taxes to the crown had increased for the third consecutive year, and the village had struggled to meet the demands of Lord Harrison's collectors. The noble families of Westoria grew richer, while villages like Oakvale scraped by on increasingly barren soil. James was about to return inside when he heard the distant sound of galloping hooves. Travelers rarely came this way, especially as winter approached. The main road to the capital of Ravenhold curved away from Oakvale, leaving the village isolated except for tax collectors and the occasional merchant brave enough to venture off. The King's Highway. Curious, he moved toward the single dirt road that wound through the village. The sound grew louder, and soon he could make out a single rider pushing a magnificent chestnut mare to its limits. Even from a distance, James could tell this was no ordinary traveler. The rider's cloak, despite being covered in dust and partially torn, was made of fine blue fabric with silver threading that caught the late afternoon sunlight. As the horse drew closer, James was shocked to see a woman clinging desperately to the saddle, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. She wore the unmistakable clothing of nobility, a silk dress beneath the cloak, with delicate embroidery visible even through the grime of hard travel. The mare slowed as it approached the village, its flanks heaving with exertion. The woman's strength finally gave out. She slipped sideways from the saddle, collapsing in a heap at the edge of the village square. James rushed forward, reaching her just as other villagers emerged from their cottages, drawn by the commotion. The woman lay unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin burning with fever. "Miss, can you hear me?" James gently turned her over. Her face was striking even in illness, high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and lips that remained remarkably full despite her dehydration. Her hair, partially contained in an elaborate style that had come undone during her ride, was a rich auburn color, rarely seen in these parts. Around her neck hung a medallion on a silver chain, partially hidden beneath her collar. "Who is she?" asked Sarah Turner, the village healer, who had hurried over when she saw the commotion. "I don't know," James replied, "but she's clearly nobility. Look at her clothes, her horse." "She's burning with fever," Sarah said, placing a weathered hand on the woman's forehead. "We need to get her inside." "Dangerous business, helping nobility," muttered old Thompson, the village elder. "Their troubles tend to become our troubles." James hesitated for only a moment. Whoever she was, the woman needed help. "I'll take her onto my cottage. It's closest." With gentle care, he lifted the unconscious woman. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel the heat of her fever through her fine clothing. "Be careful, James," warned Sarah. "I'll bring my medicines, but remember, nobles bring noble problems." Inside his cottage, James laid the woman on his bed, a simple straw mattress covered with clean linens, the finest item he owned. Sarah, arrived moments later with her basket of remedies, herbs collected during the summer months and preserved for winter illnesses. "Her fever is dangerous," Sarah said, mixing herbs in a small clay bowl. "Help me remove her cloak so we can cool her." As they eased the fine garment from the woman's shoulders, the medallion around her neck slipped free from her dress. Both James and Sarah froze at the sight of it. The pendant was a silver falcon, with wings spread in flight, clutching a ruby in its talons. Every citizen of Westoria knew that symbol, the royal crest of House Blackwood, the ruling family. "Sweet mercy," Sarah whispered. "She's from the royal court." James stared at the medallion, then at the unconscious woman's face. "Not just from the court. Look at the ruby. Only members of the royal family themselves wear the falcon with the bloodstone." The implications settled over the small cottage. Like a heavy blanket, royal family members did not travel alone. They did not ride horseback through remote villages. And they certainly did not flee, for this woman had clearly been fleeing something. "We should alert the village council," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. James shook his head. "Not yet. First, let's help her survive the night. Whatever brought her here in such a state, it must be grave indeed." For the next several hours, they worked to bring down the woman's fever. Sarah applied cool cloths to her forehead and prepared herbal teas that James carefully helped the unconscious. Woman swallow. Night fell, and still the stranger did not wake, though her breathing gradually steadied and her skin cooled slightly. "I've done what I can," Sarah said, gathering her things as midnight approached. "Keep giving her water if she'll take it. I'll return at first light." After Sarah left, James settled into a chair beside the bed. The woman occasionally murmured in her sleep, fragments of words he couldn't understand. Once she seemed to plead with someone, her hands grasping at the air before her. James found himself studying her face in the firelight. Something about her features seemed strangely familiar, though he was certain he had never seen her before. A peasant from Oakvale would have no occasion to encounter a member of the royal family. Just before dawn, the woman's eyes suddenly opened. They were a startling green, bright with lingering fever, but clear and alert. She gasped, pushing herself upright, then winced at the effort. "Be still," James said gently. "You're safe." The woman's gaze darted around the cottage before settling on him. "Where am I? Who are you?" "My name is James Miller. You're in Oakvale Village. You collapsed from your horse yesterday afternoon." She touched her neck, fingers finding the medallion. Her expression changed from confusion to alarm when she realized it was visible. Quickly she tucked it back into her dress. "Too late," James said quietly. "I've seen it. You're of House Blackwood." The woman observed him for a long moment, calculating. "And knowing that, you still help me." James shrugged. "You needed help." A faint smile crossed her lips. A simple answer. How refreshing. She attempted to sit up again, more slowly this time. "My name is Elizabeth. And yes, I'm related to the royal family, though not in the way most would assume." "I shouldn't ask questions," James said, pouring a cup of water from a pitcher beside the bed. "The affairs of nobility are not my concern." Elizabeth accepted the water, drinking deeply. "In this case, Master Miller, they soon will be. I didn't choose Oakvale by chance. I've been searching for this village, for you specifically." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Me? I've never set foot outside this region. I have no dealings with the court." "Nevertheless," Elizabeth said, her green eyes holding his with surprising intensity, "you are far more important than you know. But first—" She glanced toward the window, where the first grey light of dawn was visible. "Are there any royal guards in the village, or messengers from Lord Harrison's estate?" "No, we rarely see anyone of importance here." Elizabeth's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good. That gives us some time, though not much. They'll have tracked my horse's path by now." Who is tracking you? Why would you come looking for me? Before Elizabeth could answer, a commotion erupted outside. James moved to the window and felt his heart sink. Riding into the village square were a dozen men in the black and silver livery of the Royal Guard, led by a stern-faced captain whose armor bore the falcon crest. "They're here," he said, turning back to Elizabeth. To his surprise, she was already on her feet, though swaying slightly from weakness. "Listen carefully, James Miller. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but your life depends on believing me." She reached for the medallion around her neck and pressed it into his palm. "Take this. Hide it. If they find it, we're both dead. I don't understand. You will." Her green eyes held his with fierce determination. The story they told about the Miller bloodline is a lie. The true heir to the throne of Westoria isn't sitting in Ravenhold Castle. He's standing right here in this cottage. The royal guards pounding on doors echoed through the village as James stared at the medallion in his hand, unable to process her words. Outside, the captain's voice rang out. "By order of King Edward Blackwood, we seek a traitor to the crown. A woman of the court who has stolen a royal artifact and fled the capital." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "Whatever happens next, remember this. 25 years ago, a baby was smuggled from the royal nursery during the night of betrayal. That child was hidden here in this village with a family whose loyalty to the old king was absolute." She glanced meaningfully at a small birthmark just visible on James's right wrist, a crescent shape he had borne since birth. "The mark of the true Blackwood line," she whispered. The pounding grew closer, only 3 houses away now. "I don't believe you," James said, though a strange sensation stirred in his chest, as if some deeply buried part of him recognized the truth in her words. Elizabeth's smile was sad but determined. "You don't need to believe me yet. You just need to survive the day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The royal guards, fists hammered on James's door, the wooden frame shuddering with each blow. Elizabeth moved with surprising swiftness for someone so recently overcome by fever, pressing the medallion firmly into James's palm and closing his fingers around it. "Hide it," she whispered urgently. "Now!" James hesitated only a moment before, slipping the medallion into a small gap between the hearthstones, a hiding place he'd used since childhood for small treasures. He had just pushed it into place when the door burst open. 4 royal guards filled the doorway, their hands on sword hilts. Behind them stood Captain Nathaniel Walsh, his cold grey eyes surveying the cottage's interior before settling on Elizabeth. "Lady Elizabeth Blackwood," Walsh said, his voice carrying the refined accent of the capital. "The king demands your immediate return to court to answer for your crimes." Elizabeth straightened, and despite her illness and disheveled appearance, a remarkable transformation came over her. Her posture shifted, her chin lifted, and suddenly she embodied the noble birth that had been apparent only in her clothing before. This was clearly a woman accustomed to command. "Captain Walsh," she replied with regal composure. "I see my cousin sends his favorite hound when he fears what might be discovered." The captain's jaw tightened at her words. "You are charged with theft of royal property and treason against the crown. These are not matters to be discussed in present company." His gaze shifted meaningfully to James. "This man saved my life," Elizabeth said. "I collapsed with fever. Without his care, I would have died before you found me." Walsh studied James with new interest. "Your name, peasant?" "James Miller," he answered, keeping his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "I'm a farmer here in Oakvale. I know nothing of court matters or why the lady was travelling." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "Miller, you say?" Something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps or suspicion. How fortunate for Lady Elizabeth that she collapsed at your particular doorstep. The only doorstep that matters is the one she crossed, came a voice from behind the guards. Sarah Turner pushed her way forward, her healer's basket on her arm. I've been tending to the lady's fever through the night. She's in no condition to travel. Captain Walsh dismissed her concerns with a wave. The king's physician will attend to her upon our return. He turned to the guards. Secure Lady Elizabeth. Search the cottage thoroughly. 2 guards moved toward Elizabeth while the others began methodically examining the small cottage. Opening James's few cupboards, looking under the bed, checking the storage chest at its foot. There's nothing to find here, James said, trying to keep the nervous edge from his voice. Elizabeth did not resist as the guards took her arms, but her eyes never left James's face. Remember what I told you, she said. Not all stories in Westoria are true, especially those told by the victors. Silence, Walsh commanded. No more treasonous speech. Sarah stepped closer to James as the guards continued their search. What is happening? She whispered. What did she tell you? Before James could answer, one of the guards approached Walsh. The cottage is clean, Captain. No sign of the royal seal. Walsh frowned, clearly disappointed. Extend the search to the village. She must have hidden it somewhere. He fixed his gaze on James. If you've concealed royal property, the penalty is death. I've hidden nothing, James replied, meeting the captain's eyes. I simply offered shelter to someone in need, as any decent person would. The captain studied him for a long moment. Your decency will be noted in the official record. He turned to his men. Take Lady Elizabeth to the horses. We ride for Ravenhold immediately. As the guards led Elizabeth toward the door, she suddenly stumbled, the weakness from her fever apparently overtaking her again. She clutched at one of the guards for support, then at James as she was led past him. Thank you for your kindness, she whispered, as the guards pulled her away. Only after they had gone did James realize she had pressed something into his hand during that brief contact, a small folded piece of parchment, which he quickly concealed. In his sleeve, the village square had become a scene of controlled chaos as the royal guards conducted their search, upending market stalls and questioning villagers. Captain Walsh remained near the horses, watching as Elizabeth was helped onto a mount, her hands bound before her. What did she give you? Sarah whispered, having noticed the exchange. Not here, James murmured. Meet me at the old mill when they've gone. After a fruitless hour of searching, Walsh finally called off his men. The villagers of Oakvale watched in wary silence as the royal party mounted their horses. This village will receive another visit soon, Walsh announced to the assembled crowd. If anyone is found to have assisted in Lady Elizabeth's crimes or concealed royal property, justice will be swift and final. His eyes lingered on James for a moment before he turned his horse and led the procession out of Oakvale, Elizabeth riding between 2 guards, her back straight despite her obvious weakness. Only when the dust from their horses had settled did the villagers begin to speak, their voices a mixture of fear and confusion. Old Thompson approached James, his weathered face grave. You've brought trouble to our door, James Miller, he said. Royal trouble. I helped a sick woman, James replied. Nothing more. Nothing is ever just nothing more when it involves the Blackwoods, Thompson warned. My grandfather served in the royal kitchens during the old king's time. He said court politics are like poison, invisible until it's too late. The villagers dispersed slowly, casting wary glances at James as they returned to their homes and fields. The day's events had marked him, separated him from the community that had been his entire world. An hour later, James made his way to the abandoned mill at the edge of the village. The old water wheel had stopped turning years ago when the newer mill was built downstream, but the stone building remained, used occasionally for storage, but mostly forgotten. Sarah was waiting inside, her usually calm demeanor replaced by anxious energy. "You must tell me everything," she said without preamble. "Why would a royal lady come to Oakvale? What did she tell you?" James closed the mill door behind him and removed the parchment from his sleeve. It was sealed with a drop of wax, but bore no insignia. "She told me something impossible," he said, breaking the seal. "She claimed that I am—" He couldn't bring himself to speak the words that seemed so absurd in the light of day. "What, James? What did she claim?" "That I'm of royal blood, that I was hidden here as an infant during the night of betrayal." Sarah's face drained of color. "The night of betrayal, when the old king and queen were murdered, and their infant son with them, or so the official story goes." James unfolded the parchment. Inside was a hastily scrawled message. "James, the medallion is the key to proving your identity. Guard it with your life. Trust no one except those who recognize the crescent mark on your wrist for what it truly is. In 3 days' time, at midnight, go to the great oak at the crossroads beyond the village. A man will meet you there. Matthew Sullivan, loyal to your father's memory. He will take you to safety. I sought you out because the kingdom cannot bear another year under Edward's rule. The people starve while the nobility grows richer. Remember, your parents died to save you." James read the message twice, then handed it to Sarah. Her hands trembled slightly as she read. "This can't be real," he said, voicing the doubt that roared in his mind. "I'm James Miller, son of William Miller. I remember my father, my mother." Sarah returned the note, her expression troubled. "Your father found you when you were barely walking. He and your mother had lost their own son to fever only months before. They never hid that you came to them later, though they rarely spoke of it." James stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I was the village healer even then, James. I remember when William brought you home one night, wrapped in fine cloth unlike anything we'd seen in Oakvale. He said only that you were the child of distant relatives who had died, but there was fear in his eyes whenever anyone asked questions." The ground seemed to shift beneath James's feet. "Why have you never told me this?" "It wasn't my place," Sarah answered simply, "and William made everyone who knew swear to silence. He said it was for your protection." James paced the dusty floor of the mill, his mind racing. "Even if what she claims is true, what am I supposed to do? Challenge the King of Westoria for the throne? With what army? With what proof beyond a stolen medallion and the word of a woman? Charged with treason." Sarah watched him with sympathy. "Perhaps that's why she sought you out now, to give you that proof, to connect you with others who might support your claim. Or to use me as a pawn in some court intrigue," James countered. "For all I know, this could be an elaborate trap." "Then why would the royal guards search so desperately for that medallion? And why would Captain Walsh look at you with such suspicion when you gave your name?" James had no answer for that. He touched his wrist where the crescent-shaped birthmark had always been, a mark his father had called a blessing from the moon goddess, though he'd always seemed uneasy when James asked about it. "If you are who she claims," Sarah said carefully, "it would explain why our village has suffered such punishing taxes these past years. Perhaps someone in the capital suspects your presence here." James shook his head. "This is madness. I'm a farmer, not a—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word prince. "What will you do?" Sarah asked. "The note mentions 3 days until this Matthew Sullivan arrives." James stared at the cracks in the mill's stone floor, his life suddenly transformed from the simple rhythms of planting and harvest to a dangerous game he didn't understand and hadn't asked to play. "First," he said finally, "I need to retrieve the medallion. Then I need to learn the truth about who I really am and who my parents really were." Little did James realize that back in Ravenhold, forces were already in motion that would make his 3-day reprieve much shorter and far more dangerous than Lady Elizabeth had anticipated. The royal party had barely disappeared over the eastern hills when Oakvale erupted into frenzied speculation. By midday, James couldn't walk through the village without conversations halting abruptly or mothers pulling their children closer as he passed. The mysterious noblewoman's appearance had marked him, separated him from the community that had been his entire world. "They're afraid," Sarah explained, as they walked back from the abandoned mill, careful to keep distance between them to avoid drawing more attention. "Royal troubles have a way of consuming everything in their path." James nodded grimly. "I need answers before I make any decisions. If there's truth to Elizabeth's claims, my father, William, might have left some evidence." The small cottage felt different when James returned, as if the guard's intrusion and Elizabeth's revelations had somehow altered the very air within its walls. He moved to the hearth and carefully extracted the silver falcon medallion from its hiding place, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the ruby catching the light like a drop of blood. James had seen the royal emblem before, stamped on tax declarations and official proclamations, but never rendered with such artistry. The medallion felt heavy with significance beyond its physical weight. If Elizabeth's claims were true, this small piece of silver connected him to a birthright he had never known, and to dangers he scarcely understood. He wrapped the medallion in a piece of cloth and tucked it inside his shirt before beginning a methodical search of the cottage. If William Miller had hidden evidence of James's true origins, where would he have concealed it? The cottage offered few hiding places. James checked beneath floorboards, inside the small chest that had contained his parents' few possessions, behind the stones of the hearth. Nothing. Whatever secrets William had kept, he had taken them to his grave 3 winters past. As evening approached, a soft knock at the door startled James from his search. He quickly made sure the medallion was concealed before opening the door to find old Thompson standing there, his weathered face grave. "May I come in, boy?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. James stepped aside, apprehension building in his chest. Thompson had been the village elder for as long as James could remember, a respected figure whose judgment was sought in all matters of importance. The old man settled heavily onto a chair by the hearth, his eyes moving to the slight disarray of the cottage, evidence of James's search. "Looking for something?" Thompson asked. "Just trying to put things back in order after the guard's search," James lied. Thompson nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced. "I knew your father well, James. William Miller was a good man, honest in his dealings, faithful to his word." He paused, studying James's face, but he carried a burden that aged him beyond his years. James sat across from the elder, sensing that Thompson had come with purpose. What burden? The burden of a secret that could get him killed. And you, with him. Thompson's gnarled hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly with age. "I was there the night he brought you to Oakvale." James's heart quickened. "Sarah told me as much earlier today." "Did she tell you that William wasn't alone that night? That a woman accompanied him, a woman in a cloak too fine for our village, with the bearing of nobility despite her attempt to disguise it?" "No," James whispered. "She didn't." Thompson nodded. "I thought not. Few remember her now, and William swore us to silence. Who was she?" "She never gave her name, but she wore a medallion, much like the one that Noblewoman was trying to hide yesterday." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "The same medallion you've now hidden somewhere in this cottage." James stiffened, but said nothing. "Don't worry, boy. If I meant to betray you, the royal guards would still be here." Thompson sighed deeply. "The woman made William swear an oath that night, to raise you as his own, to never speak of your origins, and to give you this when you turned 25. From inside his weathered coat, Thompson withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. William entrusted this to me before he died, making me swear to keep it until the proper time. After today's events, I believe that time has come earlier than he anticipated. With trembling hands, James accepted the bundle. Unwrapping it revealed a sealed letter and a dagger, unlike any he had seen in Oakvale, its hilt inlaid with silver and a small green gemstone. "Your father feared this day would come," Thompson said, rising with effort. "Read his words, then. Decide your path. But remember, Westoria has lived under King Edward's rule for 25 years now. Many have forgotten what came before, and many more benefit from things remaining as they are." "Did you know?" James asked, his voice strained. "All these years, did you know who I really was?" Thompson paused at the door. "I knew you were not born a miller. Beyond that, William shared only what was necessary for your protection." His expression softened. "But I will tell you this. When that lady collapsed at your doorstep yesterday, I was not surprised. Some fates find us no matter how far we run from them." After Thompson's departure, James broke the seal on his father's letter with unsteady hands. The parchment was yellowed with age, the handwriting familiar, yet somehow more formal than he remembered his father's to be. "My son, if you are reading this, then I'm gone, and the truth I have kept from you can no longer be delayed. The task of raising you has been the greatest honor of my life. Though you came to me through tragedy rather than birth, you were born. James Edward Blackwood, only son of King Thomas and Queen Eleanor, rightful heir to the throne of Westoria. On the night your parents were murdered by Thomas's brother Edward, you were smuggled from the palace by the Queen's loyal lady-in-waiting, Margaret Sullivan. She brought you to me because I had served King Thomas faithfully as a king's ranger. Before retiring to Oakvale, your birthmark, the crescent moon on your wrist, is the mark that has appeared on firstborn royal children of the true Blackwood line for generations. The usurper Edward and his offspring do not bear this mark, which is why he had every infant bearing it killed in the months following his brother's murder. The dagger I leave you belonged to your true father. The emerald in its hilt matches your mother's eyes, the same eyes that look back at you from your own reflection. It is not merely an heirloom, but a key that, when joined with the royal medallion, reveals the location of documents proving your identity and Edward's treachery. I have kept you safe as long as I could. Forgive me for the truth I withheld, and know that in my heart you have always been my son. With love and faith in the man you have become, William Miller." James read the letter 3 times, each reading making the impossible seem more real. His entire life had been built on hidden foundations. His identity, his heritage, even his name was not what he had believed. He examined the dagger more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the balance perfect when he held it. The emerald in the hilt was exactly the shade of Elizabeth's eyes, of his mother's eyes. Instinctively, he reached for the medallion and placed it beside the dagger on the table. Something about their proximity seemed significant, but nothing happened when they touched. A key that, when joined with the royal medallion, reveals the location, James murmured, studying both objects. After several attempts at different alignments, he noticed a small indentation on the dagger's pommel that matched the size of the ruby in the medallion. When he pressed the medallion against it, he heard a faint click. The emerald in the hilt rotated slightly, revealing a tiny compartment beneath. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of parchment no larger than his smallest finger. James carefully extracted and unrolled it to find a map, detailed markings showing the route from Oakvale to a location deep in the Blackwood forest, marked with a small crown symbol. Beneath was written, "The heart sees what is hidden from eyes. The forgotten chapel holds the crown's true measure." The Blackwood forest lay 3 days' journey from Oakvale, wild and largely avoided by travelers due to persistent rumors of bandits and worse. If the map led to proof of his identity, it also led away from the relative safety of the only home he had ever known. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. James quickly concealed the dagger, medallion and map before opening the door to find Sarah. "The village is in turmoil," she said, stepping inside. "Half believe you're harboring dangerous secrets. The other half think the royal visit was merely coincidence." She paused, noting his expression. "You've learned something." James hesitated only briefly before showing her the letter. Their shared history and her knowledge of his arrival in Oakvale made concealment pointless. Sarah read in silence, her face growing pale. "The rightful king," she whispered when she finished. "James, do you understand what this means?" "It means I've been living a lie," he replied, the weight of revelation heavy in his voice, "and that I have decisions to make that will affect far more than just my life." Sarah sat beside him, her healer's hands steady as she took his. "What will you do? What will—" "Elizabeth's note mentioned a man coming in 3 days, Matthew Sullivan. According to this letter, Margaret Sullivan brought me to Oakvale. They must be related." "And the dagger? What was inside it?" James showed her the map. "Coordinates to me. Something hidden in Blackwood Forest. Proof of my identity, apparently." Sarah studied the tiny map. "This is no small thing, James. If you pursue this truth, there's no returning to the life you've known. Edward Blackwood has ruled for 25 years through fear and the support of powerful nobles. He won't surrender the throne to a farmer. From Oakvale, no matter whose blood runs in your veins." "I know," James said quietly, "but how can I ignore this? If what these letters claim is true, then Edward murdered my parents, my true parents. He's been bleeding the kingdom dry, and villages like Oakvale suffer while the nobility prospers." Before Sarah could respond, they heard shouts from the village square. James moved to the window to see torches approaching from the main road, at least 20 riders, their armor gleaming in the torchlight. "Royal guards," he said grimly, "and they're coming back much sooner than Elizabeth anticipated." Sarah joined him at the window, her face tense. "That's not the same group that left this morning. That's twice their number," and she inhaled sharply. "James, they're led by Commander Benjamin Harris." "Who?" "The King's Blade, Edward's personal executioner. They say he interrogated dozens during the purges after the night of betrayal." Sarah gripped his arm. "They're not here to search again. They're here for you." James grabbed the dagger, medallion and map. "I need to leave immediately. If they find these items, you won't make it past the village boundary," Sarah interrupted. "They'll have men positioned at every road." As the sounds of the approaching force grew louder, James made a swift decision. "The old smuggler's tunnel, the one that runs from the mill to the river. My father showed it to me when I was a boy." Sarah nodded. "Yes, few remember it now. But you'll need supplies and—" "No time," James said, already moving toward the door. "Can you create a distraction, something to draw their attention while I make for the mill?" A determined look crossed Sarah's face. "Old Thompson keeps black. Powder for clearing tree stumps. A small explosion at the granary would certainly draw their attention." James hesitated. "I can't ask you to risk yourself for me." "You didn't ask," Sarah replied firmly. "Now go, take the back path through the orchards. I'll meet you at the mill if I can." As James slipped out the rear door of his cottage, "Commander." Harris's voice echoed through the village. "By order of King Edward Blackwood, we seek James Miller of Oakvale for questioning regarding treason and conspiracy against the crown. Surrender him immediately, or this village will face the kings." "Justice!" Darkness had settled over Oakvale. As James moved silently through the back gardens and orchards, keeping to the shadows. The medallion pressed against his chest beneath his shirt, the dagger and map secure in an inner pocket of his jacket. Behind him, the voices of Commander Harris and his men echoed across the village square as they pounded on doors and demanded information. James had spent his entire life in Oakvale, knew every tree and stone, every hidden path and shortcut. Tonight, that intimate knowledge might save his life. He skirted Widow Jenkins' vegetable garden, ducked beneath the low-hanging branches of the Turner's apple orchard, and crossed the shallow stream that ran behind the smithy. As he neared the abandoned mill, a sudden explosion rocked the night. Flames erupted from the direction of the granary, followed by shouts of alarm. Sarah had created her distraction. James spared a moment to glance back at the village. The royal guards were rushing toward the fire, their torches bobbing like fireflies. In the darkness, a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He had brought this danger to Oakvale, to people who had been his neighbors and friends all his life. The abandoned mill loomed before him, its silhouette black against the night sky. James slipped inside, the familiar smell of old grain and dust filling his nostrils. He felt his way along the wall to the trap door, hidden beneath years of accumulated debris. It took all his strength to shift the heavy millstone that partially uncovered it, but finally the ancient wooden door creaked open to reveal a narrow passage descending into darkness. "I thought you might need this," came Sarah's voice from the doorway. She stood there, breathless, a small pack in one hand and a lantern in the other. "The fire is contained," she assured him. "Old Thompson and the others are handling it. The guards are occupied for now, but they'll soon realize it was a distraction." She handed him the pack. "Food for 3 days, a water skin, flint and steel, and a small knife. I would have brought more, but this is more than I expected," James said gratefully. "You shouldn't have risked coming." Sarah's expression was resolute in the dim light filtering through the mill's broken windows. "I've delivered every baby in this village for the past 15 years, including you, though you were already walking when you arrived. I won't see you hunted down like an animal." Shouts outside indicated the guards had begun a systematic search of the village outbuildings. They had little time. "Take the tunnel to the river," Sarah instructed. "Follow it downstream until you reach the fork marked by 3 tall pines. The western path leads to Blackwood Forest." She pressed something into his hand, a small cloth pouch. "Herbs for fever and infection. May you have no need of them." James embraced her quickly. "Thank you for everything." "Go," she urged. "And James, if what these letters claim is true, remember that a true king serves his people, not the other. Way around." With a final nod, James descended into the tunnel, lantern in hand. The passage was narrower than he remembered from childhood explorations, barely high enough for him to stand upright, its walls reinforced with ancient timbers that groaned under the weight of earth above. The air was thick with dampness and the smell of river mud. He moved as quickly as caution allowed, aware that each minute brought the guards closer to discovering his escape route. The tunnel had been built generations ago when the river served as the main trade route, and certain goods passed into Oakvale without the knowledge or taxation of the crown. Few remembered its existence now, but if the guards interrogated the village thoroughly enough, someone might reveal it. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, James felt a change in the air, fresher, carrying the scent of the river. The tunnel opened onto a small concealed bank, sheltered by overhanging willows. He extinguished the lantern and emerged under a sky brilliant with stars, the quarter moon providing just enough light to see. The river stretched before him, its surface black and gleaming in the moonlight. Upstream, he could see the lights of Oakvale and, more ominously, the torches of the royal guards spreading out from the village. They had expanded their search. James moved quickly along the riverbank, heading downstream, staying within the shelter of the trees that lined the water. The pack Sarah had given him bounced against his back, its weight a comforting reminder that he wasn't entirely without resources. As he walked, the revelations of the past day tumbled through his mind. James Edward Blackwood, not James Miller, son of a murdered king, not a retired king's ranger, heir to a throne, not a modest farm. The concepts were too vast to fully comprehend, especially while fleeing for his life through the darkness. By dawn, James had reached the fork in the river marked by 3 towering pine trees, just as Sarah had described. He was exhausted, having walked through the night without rest, but fear and urgency had kept him moving. Now, as the eastern sky lightened with the first pale glow of morning, he faced a choice. The map hidden in the dagger indicated Blackwood, forest to the west, where evidence of his identity supposedly lay hidden. But Elizabeth's note had directed him to meet Matthew Sullivan at the great oak beyond the village in 2 days' time. The oak lay to the north. James settled beneath a sheltering tree to rest briefly and consider his options. If he followed the map to Blackwood Forest, he might find proof of his heritage, something that would be crucial if he ever hoped to challenge Edward's claim to the throne. But if he missed the meeting with Sullivan, he could lose his connection to allies within the kingdom who recognized his claim. As he pondered, a distant sound caught his attention: hounds baying. The royal guards had brought tracking dogs. His trail along the riverbank would be easy to follow, even for less skilled hunters than the king's men. The decision made itself. James rose quickly and waded into the river, moving upstream for several 100 yards to break the scent trail before emerging on the western bank. The Blackwood Forest would offer better cover than the open farmland to the north, and it aligned with his more immediate need to evade capture. The forest's edge loomed before him, dark and forbidding. Unlike the managed woodlands near Oakvale, Blackwood Forest was ancient and largely untamed. Local stories told of travelers who entered its depths and never returned, of strange lights seen among the trees at night, of voices that whispered from the shadows. James had always dismissed such tales as the fanciful inventions of village storytellers. But as he approached the wall of massive trees, a shiver that had nothing to do with his damp clothes ran through him. Beyond this point was truly unknown territory, both the forest itself and the future it might lead him toward. The baying of the hounds grew louder. James took a deep breath and plunged into the forest. The change was immediate and disorienting. The dawn light that had begun to illuminate the riverbank barely penetrated the dense canopy overhead. The forest floor was soft with centuries of fallen leaves, muffling his footsteps, but making the terrain treacherous with hidden roots and sudden dips. James pressed on, moving as quickly as caution allowed, checking the crude map periodically. The faint trail marked on it seemed to follow a creek that should lie ahead if his orientation was correct. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded behind him, but whether that meant he had successfully evaded the hounds, or simply that the dense forest was absorbing the sound, he couldn't tell. After several hours of steady travel, James reached a small clearing where a shaft of sunlight broke through the canopy. Exhaustion finally overtook him, and he sank down against a fallen log, allowing himself a small portion of the bread and dried meat from Sarah's pack. As he ate, he withdrew the medallion and dagger, studying them in the better light. The silver falcon gleamed even in the dim forest light, its ruby eyes seeming to watch him. The dagger, now that he could examine it properly, bore intricate engravings along its blade, symbols he didn't recognize, but that clearly represented significant craftsmanship. These were physical connections to a heritage he had never known, to parents whose faces he couldn't remember. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, jolting James to alertness. He quickly concealed the items and rose, scanning the trees around him. The clearing suddenly seemed exposed rather than restful. Movement caught his eye, a flash of grey between distant trees. Too small for a royal guard in armour, but definitely a person. James reached for the dagger, its unfamiliar weight somehow comforting in his hand. "I know you're there," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Show yourself." Silence stretched for several seconds. Then a figure stepped into the clearing, a girl no more than 16, dressed in rough leather and forest greens, a bow held loosely in her hand. Her dark hair was tied back in a practical braid, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes sharp and assessing as she regarded him. "You're making enough noise to wake the forest spirits," she said, her accent unfamiliar to James. "And you're being followed." James tightened his grip on the dagger. "By you?" she snorted. "I found you by accident. I meant the king's men. They've entered the forest about 2 miles back with dogs." She glanced at his clothing, his pack. "You're from Oakvale, the one they're hunting. How do you know that?" "News travels, even in the forest." She gestured to the trees behind her. "You need to move. This way." James hesitated. "Why would you help me?" For the first time, a smile flickered across the girl's face. "Because anyone. The king wants dead this badly as someone I'd like to keep alive." She touched her right wrist briefly, drawing James's attention to a mark there, a crescent similar to his own, though hers appeared to be tattooed rather than a birthmark. "My name is Rachel," she said, "and if you're who I think you are, there are people who have been waiting a very long time to meet you." Before James could question her further, the distant baying of hounds carried through the forest. Rachel's expression hardened. "Decide now," she said. "Follow me, or take your chances with the king's hunters." James weighed his options quickly. This girl was a stranger, possibly leading him into a trap. But the hounds' voices were growing closer, and she had recognized the significance of the crescent mark. "Lead on," he said, securing his pack. Rachel nodded once, then turned and moved into the forest with the silent grace of someone who had spent their life among the trees. James followed, struggling to match her pace while maintaining his footing. On the uneven ground. "Where are we going?" he asked in a hushed voice. "To the heart of the forest," Rachel replied without turning. "To the people who've kept your secret for 25 years. The Crescent Guardians." Rachel moved through Blackwood Forest like a ghost, barely disturbing the foliage as she led James deeper into territory unmarked on any royal map. She chose paths invisible to untrained eyes, sometimes backtracking or crossing streams to confuse the hounds that still bayed in the distance, though their voices gradually grew fainter. "How much farther?" James asked as the day wore on, his legs aching from the relentless pace. Unlike Rachel, he crashed through the underbrush, his farmer's build lacking her woodland grace. "We'll reach the camp by nightfall," she replied, pausing, briefly to let him catch up. "If you can maintain this pace." "I've spent my life working fields from dawn to dusk," James said, a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "I can keep up." Rachel studied him, her expression unreadable. "Farming builds. Strength, but not the kind needed here. You move too loudly, breathe too heavily, snap too many twigs. I wasn't raised to sneak through forests," James retorted. "No," she said with a hint of a smile. "You were raised to rule a kingdom. Yet here we are." The casual way she referenced his heritage, this secret he'd only learned yesterday, caught James off guard. "How do you know who I am? I don't even fully believe it myself." Rachel touched the crescent mark on her wrist. "The Guardians have watched for your return since the night of betrayal. We've protected the secret of your survival, waiting for the time when the true Blackwood heir would reclaim the throne." "You're too young to have been there that night," James observed. "I was born into the Guardians," she explained. "My parents served your father, King Thomas." She glanced at him. "Did Lady Elizabeth tell you much before the guards took her?" James shook his head. "Only that I was hidden as an infant during the coup, and that my birthmark proves my lineage." Rachel nodded. "The crescent mark appears only in the true Blackwood line. Edward and his son Frederick don't bear it, one reason they've hunted down anyone who does." She gestured for him to continue following. "I'll tell you more as we walk. We can't afford to linger." As they moved deeper into the forest, Rachel revealed the history that had been kept from James all his life. The Crescent Guardians had formed on the night of Edward's coup, loyal nobles, servants and soldiers who had escaped the slaughter at the palace and dedicated themselves to protecting the rightful line of succession. Margaret Sullivan was one of the first, Rachel explained. She was Queen Eleanor's lady-in-waiting and closest confidant. It was Margaret who smuggled you from the nursery while the palace burned. My father's letter mentioned her, James said, and Elizabeth's note referenced a Matthew Sullivan coming to meet me. Matthew is Margaret's son and our current leader, Rachel confirmed. He's spent his life preparing for the day the true heir would return. The forest grew denser as they progressed, the trees older and more massive. James felt as though they were traveling backward in time, into a Westoria that existed before human settlements. Occasionally, Rachel would stop and touch specific trees, seeming to orient herself by marks invisible to James. The forest protects us, she explained during one such pause. Blackwood has never fully submitted to being mapped or tamed. That's why the Guardians chose it as our sanctuary. As twilight descended, the character of the forest changed. James began to notice small carved symbols on certain trees, crescents, stars, and other shapes he didn't recognize. Boundary markers, Rachel explained. We're entering Guardian territory. A low whistle from somewhere above startled James. Rachel answered with a similar call, then gestured him forward. We've been spotted by our sentries. We're safe now. The King's men never venture this deep into Blackwood. The camp James had envisioned turned out to be far more permanent than the name suggested. As they climbed a small rise, the trees opened to reveal a hidden valley where dozens of structures had been built among the massive trees. Some on the ground, others connected by rope bridges suspended among the branches. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the settlement. People moved about, men and women of various ages, dressed similarly to Rachel in practical, earth-toned clothing. Some carried weapons, others baskets of forest herbs or game. Children darted between the structures, their laughter a surprising sound in this hidden place. "Welcome to Haven," Rachel said, watching his amazed expression. "Home of the Crescent Guardians for 25 years. As they descended into the valley, people began to notice their arrival. Activity halted as all eyes turned to James. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and even the children grew quiet. The scrutiny made James acutely uncomfortable. These strangers looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe to skepticism. A tall man with graying temples stepped forward from the gathered crowd. Despite his simple clothing, he carried himself with natural authority. The crescent mark was visible on his wrist, darker than James's, but unmistakably the same shape. "Rachel," he acknowledged with a nod. "I see your hunting trip yielded unexpected game." "He was fleeing the King's men near the western edge," Rachel replied. "They had hounds." The man turned his full attention to James, his dark eyes intense as they took in every detail of the newcomer's appearance. "I am Matthew Sullivan," he said. "My mother gave her life to save yours 25 years ago." James felt the weight of expectation in the man's gaze. "I'm James Miller," he said, then corrected himself. "Or James Blackwood, apparently. Until yesterday, I knew nothing of any of this." Matthew's eyebrows rose slightly. "You bear the mark," he said, gesturing to James's wrist, "and your resemblance to your father is remarkable. But Lady Elizabeth was supposed to prepare you before bringing you to us." "Elizabeth was arrested by royal guards," James explained. "She fell ill near my village and was captured before she could tell me much. She left a message saying you would meet me at the Great Oak by the crossroads." Matthew frowned. "Elizabeth's capture complicates matters. If she's interrogated—" "She seemed more concerned about this," James said, carefully withdrawing the silver falcon medallion. A collective gasp rose from the gathered guardians. Matthew's composure faltered for the first time. "The king's seal," he whispered. "She actually managed to take it." He glanced sharply at the gathered crowd. "Return to your duties. We will speak in the council chamber." As the crowd dispersed, Matthew led James and Rachel toward the largest structure at the center of the settlement, a building constructed around the trunk of an enormous oak, its entrance adorned with intricate wood carvings. Inside, a central fire pit cast dancing light on walls covered with maps, weapons, and tapestries bearing the crescent symbol. Several older guardians were already gathered around a large table, their expressions solemn as James entered. "Friends," Matthew announced, "the one we have awaited has found his way to us at last. James Edward Blackwood, son of Thomas and Eleanor, rightful heir to the throne of Westoria." The elders studied James with the same intense scrutiny Matthew had shown. One elderly woman with steel-grey hair rose from her seat, approaching James slowly. "Let me look at you," she said, her voice cracking with age. She reached up to touch his face, turning it to catch the firelight. Yes, Thomas's jawline, but Eleanor's eyes, and the mark, clear as day. She smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "I held you as a babe, the night we fled the palace. You cried until Margaret sang to you." James stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to this emotional greeting from a stranger. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember any of that. Until yesterday, I believed William and Mary Miller were my parents." "William Miller was one of us," Matthew explained. "A king's ranger who served your father faithfully. When we needed a safe place to hide you, far from court intrigues, he volunteered to take you in as his own." "He left me a letter," James said. "And this." He removed the dagger from his pack, placing it beside the medallion on the table. Another collective reaction rippled through the elders. Matthew lifted the dagger reverently, examining its craftsmanship. "King Thomas's personal blade," he confirmed, "given to him by Queen Eleanor on their wedding day." He looked at James with new intensity. "Did William tell you its significance?" "Only that it serves as a key when joined with the medallion," James replied. "I found a map hidden inside, leading to somewhere in Blackwood Forest." Matthew and the grey-haired woman exchanged significant glances. "He speaks of the sanctuary," the woman said. "The hidden chapel," James recalled from the message. The note said, "The forgotten chapel holds the crown's true measure." Matthew nodded slowly. "The sanctuary was built by the first Blackwood king, hidden deep within the forest. It contains not only the ancient crown, but documents proving the legitimacy of the bloodline, birth records, marriage contracts, the original charter of Westoria. If Edward had found it, he would have destroyed everything. And now I'm supposed to find it and—" "What?" James asked, the frustration of the past day finally breaking through. "Challenge a king who's ruled for 25 years. With what army? What support? I'm a farmer, not a warrior or politician." "You are the rightful king," the elderly woman said firmly. "That means more in Westoria than you realize. Edward's rule has brought prosperity to the nobles, but suffering to the common people. Taxes rise while harvests fail. Villages starve while the court feasts. Elizabeth risked everything to find you now because the kingdom cannot endure much more," Matthew added. "Edward's son Frederick is worse than his father. Cruel where Edward is merely cold, violent where Edward is calculating. When Edward dies, Frederick's reign will bring Westoria to ruin." "A true king doesn't need to know everything," Matthew said. "He needs to care about his people and be wise enough to seek counsel from those who understand what he does not." James stared into the fire, wrestling with concepts too large to fully grasp. Yesterday he had been James Miller, concerned about harvest yields and village taxes. Today he was being told he was Westoria's salvation. "What about Elizabeth?" he asked finally. "She risked everything to find me. I can't just abandon her to Edward's dungeons." Matthew's expression darkened. "Elizabeth's capture is indeed troubling. As the daughter of Edward's chief advisor, her actions will be seen as the highest treason. They'll execute her once they've extracted whatever information she possesses. Daughter of Edward's advisor. James was stunned. She's from the inner court? Lord Richard Kenton has been Edward's right hand for 20 years, the elderly woman explained. His daughter Elizabeth grew up in the palace, but secretly came to sympathize with our cause after witnessing the suffering Edward's policies caused. She became our most valuable source of information, Matthew added. Her position gave her access to the king's chambers. How she managed to take the royal seal. If she's broken under interrogation, not only is her life forfeit, but our entire network at court could be exposed. The implications settled heavily on James. Elizabeth had risked everything to find him, to restore a rightful king she believed would rule more justly than Edward. Now she faced torture and execution for that belief. How long would it take to reach the capital? He asked. A startled silence fell over the chamber. Matthew was the first to recover. You can't possibly be considering... How long? James repeated firmly. 3 days hard riding, Rachel answered, when no one else would. Less if you push the horses. That's madness, Matthew protested.
Yes, it's just that nu man ben leaders as accept for astle vexit den troatchen amgefuhal und das Kareben tamrelaxen. Van mijn lelle, so vervatelijk ik in en zullen doen gewijs. Sagis, blurt is a some that good as sus all sent to Anton
Me for who I truly am. And why would a simple farmer enter Ravenhold? The elderly woman asked, though her eyes showed a glimmer of respect for his courage. James looked down at the medallion and dagger on the table. Because before I can decide whether to claim a throne, I need to understand what kind of king I would be. And letting someone die for my sake when I could try to save them tells me everything I don't want to be. The council chamber erupted into heated debate following James's declaration. Matthew Sullivan paced the room, his expression alternating. Between frustration and grudging respect, you propose to walk into Ravenhold, the most heavily guarded city in Westoria, to rescue a prisoner from the royal dungeons, he summarized. A prisoner who, I might add, is likely being watched by Edward's most loyal guards in hopes that her conspirators will attempt exactly this kind of rescue. I didn't say it would be easy, James replied. Easy? It's impossible, countered an older guardian with a weathered face and a scar running down his cheek. I commanded King Thomas's personal guard before the coup. Ravenhold's defenses were formidable then. They're impenetrable now. Edward's paranoia has turned the capital into a fortress. Rachel, who had remained silent during most of the exchange, finally spoke. Not entirely impenetrable. There are ways into the city that don't involve the main gates. All eyes turned to her. Matthew's expression darkened. Rachel, he should know all his options, she insisted. If he's determined to go, better he goes informed than blind. The elderly woman who had greeted James so emotionally earlier nodded in agreement. The boy has his father's stubborn honor. We won't dissuade him with warnings. She turned to James. I am Diana Crawford. I served as your mother's personal healer and midwife. I delivered you into this world, and I would prefer not to see you leave it so soon after finding us. She approached the table and pulled forward one of the maps displayed. On the wall, a detailed rendering of Ravenhold that appeared far more current than its yellowed edges suggested. Our networks in the capital have mapped the city thoroughly, she explained, including certain unofficial entrances that even Edward doesn't know exist. Smugglers' tunnels, Rachel elaborated, similar to the one you used to escape Oakvale, but far more extensive. They run beneath the river and emerge in the lower city. Matthew sighed heavily, recognizing the turn of the conversation. If you're determined to attempt this madness, you cannot go as James Miller, farmer from Oakvale. That name is now known. To the Royal Guard. They'll have distributed your description to every checkpoint and patrol. Then who should I be? James asked. Matthew exchanged glances with Diana. We maintain certain identities for our agents. Merchants, servants, tradespeople with legitimate business in the capital. You could pose as Thomas Bennett, a carpenter from the western provinces come to seek work in the city. I know nothing about carpentry, James pointed out. You won't need to demonstrate your skills, Diana assured him. The identity is merely to get you through the gates. Once inside, you'll contact our allies who can help you access the palace. The scarred guard captain shook his head. This plan is folly. Even if he reaches the dungeons, how does he free Lady Elizabeth and escape with her? The palace dungeons are in the most secure section of the keep. Daniel is right, Matthew said. A rescue from within the palace is virtually impossible. Our best hope would be to intercept her during transport. He turned to James. Prisoners of Elizabeth's rank are typically tried before the Royal Assembly. She would be moved from the dungeon to the Hall of Justice on the day of her trial. When would that be? James asked. If Edward follows his usual pattern for cases of treason, 3 days from now, Diana replied. He likes to make a spectacle of such trials, a warning to others who might oppose him. James studied the map, trying to absorb the layout of a city he'd never seen. 3 days. How close can your smuggler's tunnels get me to this Hall of Justice? Rachel traced a path on the map. The nearest exit would be here, in the merchant quarter, still a considerable distance from the palace grounds. Not close enough, Daniel said flatly. The palace itself is surrounded by a separate wall with only 4 access points, all heavily guarded. No unauthorized person enters without extensive scrutiny. A contemplative silence fell over the chamber until Diana spoke. There is one way. Her words carried a weight that drew everyone's attention. A way that has been discussed but never attempted. She looked directly at Matthew, who seemed to understand her meaning immediately. Absolutely not, he said firmly. What way? James asked. Diana held Matthew's gaze steadily. Tell him. After a moment's resistance, Matthew sighed. The night of ceremonies. It happens once a year when Edward opens the palace to select citizens, nobles, wealthy merchants, guildmasters, a grand celebration to maintain the illusion that he rules with the people's blessing. And this night of ceremonies is, James prompted. 3 days from now, Diana finished. The same day Elizabeth is likely to be tried. James looked between them. That can't be coincidence. It isn't, Matthew confirmed. Edward often schedules high-profile executions to coincide with royal celebrations. It reinforces his message. Enjoy my generosity, but remember the price of defiance, so I could enter the palace as a guest of this celebration, James asked. Daniel laughed without humor. Every guest is personally vetted by the royal chamberlain. Family histories are examined, connections verified. You can't simply appear on the guest list. No, Diana agreed, but guests are permitted to bring servants, and servants receive far less scrutiny than their masters. Understanding dawned on James. You have someone attending this celebration who could bring me in as their servant. Matthew nodded reluctantly. Lord Henry Taylor. He's sympathetic to our cause, though not an active guardian. His daughter was one of the children executed during Edward's purge of crescent-marked families. He would recognize the significance of your birthmark, Diana added. And he has sufficient influence to deflect casual questions about a new servant. Even if that gets you inside, Daniel persisted, how do you reach the dungeons? How do you free Elizabeth? How do you escape afterward? This plan has too many uncertain elements. James stared at the map, overwhelmed by the complexity of what they discussed. He was a farmer attempting to navigate court intrigue and palace security with only days of preparation. I can help, Rachel said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "I know the palace layout. I've studied it my entire life." "Absolutely not," Matthew said flatly. "You're not going to Ravenhold." "I'm the most qualified," she insisted. "I can move without being noticed. I speak with a capital accent when needed, and I know the hidden passages within the palace walls." "Hidden passages?" James asked. Diana nodded. The palace was built over centuries, with each king adding new sections. The oldest parts contain servant corridors, ventilation shafts, and maintenance tunnels that don't appear on official plans. "Rachel is too valuable to risk," Matthew countered. "She's one of our most skilled—" "Precisely why I should go," Rachel interrupted. "This mission requires skill, not just courage." She looked at James. "No offense, but you'd be captured within an hour without guidance." James couldn't argue with her assessment. "You've been inside the palace before." "Twice," she confirmed. "Once to map the eastern wing, and once to extract an informant from the kitchens. I know the hidden routes to the dungeons." The debate continued for hours, with plans proposed, rejected, and refined. Maps were consulted, guard rotations discussed, contingencies considered. Throughout, James found himself increasingly reliant on the Guardian's knowledge, while contributing what he could. Practical questions that sometimes revealed flaws in their more elaborate schemes. As the night deepened, a plan emerged. James and Rachel would travel to Ravenhold disguised as merchant travelers. Once there, they would contact Lord Taylor, who would bring them into the palace as servants during the night of ceremonies. Using the hidden passages, they would attempt to reach Elizabeth either in the dungeons or during her transport to trial, depending on the timing. "The riskiest phase will be the escape," Matthew concluded. "Once Elizabeth is freed, every guard in the palace will be searching for you. That's why we need to establish multiple exit routes." He traced several paths on the map. "The river gate, if you can reach it unseen. The servants' entrance during the height of the celebration, when deliveries are constant, or, if necessary, the old aqueduct tunnel beneath the East Tower." James struggled to memorize the details, acutely aware of how unprepared he was for this mission. His entire life had centered around crop rotations and weather patterns, not palace layouts and guard schedules. "We should rest," Diana suggested, noting James's exhaustion. "You'll depart at first light, and there's much preparation still to be done." As the council dispersed, Matthew pulled James aside. "I respect your determination to save Elizabeth," he said quietly. "But never forget what you represent. Your life is not merely your own to risk. You are the hope of Westoria, the true heir who could end 25 years of Edward's tyranny." "I'm still not convinced of that," James admitted. "This identity, this heritage, it doesn't feel real to me yet." "It is reality nonetheless," Matthew replied, "whether you feel it or not." He hesitated. "There's something you should see before you depart tomorrow. Something that might help you understand the weight of the legacy you carry." Matthew led James through the sleeping settlement to a structure set apart from the others. A simple building, with no windows, its entrance guarded by 2 guardians who nodded respectfully as Matthew approached. Inside, a single lantern illuminated what appeared to be a small shrine. "The few treasures we managed to save from the palace," Matthew explained. "The walls held portraits, a handsome man with James's jawline and a woman with striking green eyes, both wearing the formal regalia of Westoria's monarchs, King Thomas and Queen Eleanor, his parents." James approached slowly, studying faces he had no memory of, but that shared undeniable similarities with his own. The king's portrait showed a man of quiet strength, his expression thoughtful rather than imposing. The queen's revealed intelligence and warmth in equal measure. "They were beloved," Matthew said softly. "Not just respected or feared, as Edward is, but truly loved by their people. They ruled with justice and compassion." Below the portraits lay a few personal items, a journal written in elegant script that Matthew identified as Queen Eleanor's, a ceremonial sword that had belonged to King Thomas, a small music box that had reportedly been in James's nursery. These survived because loyal servants grabbed what they could during the coup, Matthew explained. Small treasures, but they connect us to what was lost that night. James carefully opened the journal, finding the last entry dated the day before the coup. The Queen wrote of her hopes for her young son, of the kind of man and king she prayed he would become, the words of a mother who would never see her child grow up. "I don't remember them," James said, a deep sadness welling within him for parents he had never known. "I don't remember any of this." "You were barely walking," Matthew reminded him, "but they knew you. They loved you, and they died ensuring you would survive." James closed the journal gently, overwhelmed. "William and Mary Miller were the only parents I ever knew. They raised me, taught me, loved me. I can't simply discard that to embrace a heritage I don't remember." "No one is asking you to," Matthew responded. "William Miller was one of the finest men I ever knew. His choice to raise you as his son was the greatest service he could have offered his true king. Honor his memory by understanding why he made that sacrifice, because he believed in the Westoria that your father and mother tried to build." James looked again at the portraits, trying to connect with these strangers who had given him life. "If I do this, if I attempt to claim the throne, it wouldn't be for them," he said finally. "It would be for the people suffering under Edward's rule. For villages like Oak Vale being crushed by taxes they can't pay. For children going hungry while the court feasts." Matthew smiled slightly. "That's exactly what they would have wanted. A king who rules for his people, not for his own glory." As James prepared to leave, he noticed one more item on the shrine, a small wooden toy soldier, crudely carved, but painted with careful detail in the uniform of the Royal Guard. Matthew saw his interest. "That was yours," he said. "The only toy you managed to keep clutched in your hand during the escape from the palace. You wouldn't let it go, even in your sleep." James lifted the small figure, feeling a strange disconnection. This had been his, yet he had no memory of it. Like the kingdom that was supposedly his birthright, it belonged to a life that felt like someone else's story. "Get some rest," Matthew advised. "Tomorrow you begin a journey that will either end in Elizabeth's rescue or—" He left the alternative unspoken. As James lay on a pallet in a small hut assigned to him, sleep eluded him. The wooden soldier rested in his palm, a tangible connection to a past he couldn't remember, but that had suddenly claimed his future. Tomorrow he would leave the safety of Haven for Ravenhold, the heart of Edward's power, risking everything for a woman he barely knew, but who had risked her life to find him. Whether he succeeded or failed would determine not just Elizabeth's fate, but potentially the future of Westoria itself. It was a weight no farmer from Oakvale should have to bear, yet somehow, in the quiet darkness of the Guardian camp, James began to accept that perhaps he had been preparing for this burden his entire life without knowing it. Dawn broke over Haven with a gentle mist rising from the forest floor. The Guardians moved with quiet efficiency, preparing supplies for James and Rachel's journey to Ravenhold. Fresh horses, faster and less distinctive than James's farm horse, were saddled and loaded with provisions carefully chosen to support their merchant disguise. James emerged from his hut wearing clothes provided by the Guardians, sturdy travelling garments of better quality than his farmer's attire, but not fine enough to draw attention. The royal medallion hung concealed beneath his shirt, while his father's dagger was hidden in his boot. "Your appearance is convincing enough," Matthew said, inspecting him critically. "But your bearing will give you away if you're not careful. Merchants carry themselves with confidence, but defer properly to nobility. I've dealt with merchants at village markets," James replied. Matthew shook his head. "Country traders are different from capital merchants. Remember, Thomas Bennet is moderately successful, seeking new opportunities in Ravenhold, not desperate, not arrogant, assured of his skills, but respectful of rank. The complexity of maintaining this fiction while navigating a city he'd never visited felt overwhelming. Before James could respond, Rachel appeared, transformed from the forest-dwelling archer he'd met yesterday. She wore a simple dress of good quality, her previously wild hair tamed into a neat braid, appropriate for a merchant's daughter. Most remarkably, her demeanor had shifted completely. The way she walked, the set of her shoulders, even her facial expressions seemed to belong to a different person. Ruth Bennet, she introduced herself with a perfect urban accent, curtsying slightly. Daughter of Thomas Bennet, carpenter of Pinehaven. That's... James searched for words. Impressive. Rachel has been trained since childhood in the arts of disguise and observation, Diana explained, approaching with a small pouch. She truly is our best chance for this mission's success. The elderly healer handed the pouch to James. Herbs for your journey. This one for sleep if needed, this for pain, this for fever. She indicated each small packet. And this, she added, holding up a final bundle wrapped in red cloth, is only for the direst emergency. It produces a smoke that causes confusion and disorientation, useful for creating chaos during an escape, but dangerous if misused. Daniel's expression softened slightly. Your father, your birth father, wasn't a natural swordsman either. King Thomas preferred diplomacy to combat, though he trained diligently because he understood a ruler must be prepared to defend his people. He positioned the sword at James's hip. With luck, you won't need to draw it. Matthew called the company together for final instructions. Your journey to Ravenhold should take 2 days if you maintain a steady pace. The night of ceremonies is the evening after tomorrow. Lord Taylor will be watching for your signal at the Lion's Head Tavern tomorrow night. He handed James a sealed message. This contains the recognition phrases and proof of your identity for Lord Taylor. Memorize the contents, then destroy it. Before you reach the capital, the parting from the Guardians was solemn. Despite having known them for less than a day, James felt the weight of their hopes and fears as they bid him farewell. These people had dedicated their lives to preserving the memory of his parents and the possibility of his return. Whether he embraced his heritage or not, he owed them his best effort. Diana embraced him with surprising strength for her age. You have your mother's eyes, she whispered. And her courage, I think. Come back to us. As James mounted his horse, Matthew approached for a final word. Remember, your priority is Elizabeth's rescue, not confrontation with Edward. This mission is about information and allies, not yet open challenge to the throne. James nodded. I understand. With final farewells exchanged, James and Rachel rode out of Haven, following a hidden trail that would eventually connect with the main road to Ravenhold. As the Guardian settlement disappeared behind them, James felt a strange mixture of relief and loss, relief to be acting rather than just absorbing revelations, but loss of the brief sense of belonging he'd felt among people who knew his true identity. You're quiet? Rachel observed when they'd been riding for an hour. There's a lot to process, James replied. 2 days ago I was a farmer worried about taxes. Now I'm riding to the capital to rescue a noblewoman while apparently being the rightful king of Westoria. Rachel smiled slightly. When you say it that way, it does sound rather overwhelming. That's because it is overwhelming. James adjusted, in his saddle, still unaccustomed to the finer horse beneath him. What about you? You seem remarkably calm about risking your life for this mission. I was raised for this, she answered simply. Every Guardian child learns the history of the coup, studies the layout of Ravenhold, trains in combat and stealth. Our purpose has always been to prepare for the day the true heir would reclaim the throne. That's a heavy burden to place on children. Rachel considered this. No heavier than the burden placed on you without your knowledge. They rode in silence for a while, the forest gradually thinning as they approached more populated areas. By midday, they reached a point where their trail joined the King's Highway, the main road connecting Western Westoria to the capital. From here where Thomas and Ruth Bennett, Rachel reminded him, subtly shifting her posture and expression into her merchant's daughter persona. Father and daughter traveling to seek new markets for our carpentry. We should practice your accent. It still carries too much rural inflection. For the next several hours, as they traveled the increasingly busy road, Rachel drilled James on the details of his disguise. She corrected his speech, refined his mannerisms, and quizzed him repeatedly on the fictional background they'd created. James struggled to maintain the pretense consistently, his farmer's directness repeatedly breaking through the more elaborate speech patterns of a town merchant. "You're too honest in your responses," Rachel critiqued, after a particularly unconvincing exchange with a road patrol. A merchant always considers how each answer might benefit or harm his business prospects. You answer like someone who has nothing to hide, because until 3 days ago, I didn't have anything to hide, James pointed out. By evening, they reached a coaching inn where travelers gathered before the final approach to Ravenhold. The common room buzzed with conversation, merchants discussing market conditions, pilgrims traveling to the capital's temples, farmers bringing produce to sell. James and Rachel secured a corner table, careful to maintain their disguises even. "In private conversation, listen to the talk," Rachel advised quietly. "Information flows freely here." James did as suggested, allowing the surrounding conversations to wash over him. Most seemed mundane, complaints about road conditions or excitement, about the upcoming celebrations in the capital. But gradually, he began to notice an undercurrent of tension in certain exchanges. "Doubled the grain tax again," a farmer muttered to his companion. "Can't feed my family at these rates." "My cousin tried appealing to the magistrate," another replied, found himself in the stocks for seditious complaint. At a nearby table, 2 merchants spoke in hushed tones. "Lord Kenton's daughter arrested for treason. Can you believe it? They say she stole something from the king's own chambers. Execution scheduled for the night of ceremonies," his companion responded. "Edward makes examples of nobles who betray him, reminds the rest of us what happens when you cross the crown." James, and tensed at the mention of Elizabeth, Rachel placed a warning hand on his arm, a subtle reminder to maintain his disguise despite the provocative information. "The people seem unhappy," James observed quietly when they had retired to their room. Later, "Edward's rule has grown harsher in recent years," Rachel confirmed. "Taxes increase while harvests fail. The nobles grow richer while villagers starve. It's why Elizabeth risked everything to find you. The kingdom cannot bear much more." James paced the small room, processing all he had heard. If what they say is true, Elizabeth's execution is already scheduled. We may not have the opportunity to intercept her during transport to trial. "Public executions are held in the palace courtyard," Rachel said grimly. "It complicates our rescue, but doesn't make it impossible. The night of ceremonies creates confusion we can use to our advantage." As James prepared for sleep, he removed the medallion from beneath his shirt, studying it in the dim candlelight. The silver falcon seemed to watch him with its ruby eye, a constant reminder of the heritage he hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. "Do you truly believe I'm the rightful king?" he asked suddenly. Rachel, who had been checking her weapons, looked up at him. "I've believed it my entire life," she said simply. "My parents died protecting the secret of your survival. Every guardian has sacrificed for this cause." "That's not what I asked," James persisted. "Do you, personally, believe I should rule Westoria? Not because of my birth, but because I would be a better king than Edward or his son." Rachel considered the question seriously. "I don't know you well enough to answer that," she admitted finally, "but I know Edward is a tyrant whose rule has brought suffering to Westoria. And I know you risked your own safety to attempt to save Elizabeth when you could have remained hidden in the forest." She returned to her preparations. "Perhaps that's enough to begin with. The kind of king you might become. That's a question only time can answer." James tucked the medallion away, Rachel's honest assessment oddly more comforting than blind faith would have been. Tomorrow they would reach Ravenhold, and the true test of his courage and perhaps his worthiness would begin. 10 years after the events that shook the kingdom of Westoria to its foundations, a celebration unlike any before filled the streets of Ravenhold. Citizens from every corner of the realm gathered in the capital, their faces alight with genuine joy rather than the forced revelry of Edward's reign. Banners bearing the silver falcon with the ruby eye, now restored to its proper meaning as a symbol of just rule rather than tyranny, hung from every building. King James Blackwood II stood on the palace balcony overlooking the Grand Square, the same location where Edward had once pronounced harsh judgments and displayed his enemies. Today, it served a different purpose, to allow the people to see their king as he commemorated a decade of rebuilding. "You're brooding again," came a familiar voice from behind him. "The royal advisors will think you're having second thoughts about the amnesty decree." James turned to see Elizabeth approaching, her green eyes, so like his mother's, bright with affection. The years had added dignity to her beauty, and the simple silver circlet in her auburn hair denoted her position as the king's most trusted counselor. "Not brooding," James corrected. "Remembering. It seems impossible that 10 years have passed since that night." Elizabeth joined him at the balcony rail, gazing out at the celebratory crowds. "The people certainly haven't forgotten. They're calling it Liberation Day now, the night King James reclaimed his throne." James smiled at the irony. The official histories spoke of a triumphant return, a rightful king boldly confronting the usurper. The reality had been far messier. The rescue attempt had gone disastrously wrong. Despite their careful planning, James and Rachel had been captured in the palace dungeons. Their disguises as servants during the night of ceremonies had gotten them inside, but an unexpected change in the guard rotation had trapped them in the lower levels. Rather than finding and freeing Elizabeth, they had been thrown into cells of their own. The night had seemed destined to end with 3 executions instead of 1. Then came the moment that changed everything, when Commander Harris brought him before Edward for questioning, and the aging usurper had seen the crescent birthmark on James's wrist. The shock on Edward's face had been visible to everyone in the throne room. "I still remember Edward's expression when he realized who you were," Elizabeth said, as if reading his thoughts. 25 years of paranoia justified in an instant. What neither of them had anticipated was Edward's son Frederick, who had been standing beside his father's throne. The prince, seeing his father's shock and understanding its cause, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had drawn his sword, determined to eliminate the threat to his inheritance immediately. Frederick always was impulsive, James observed. If he had waited, let his father handle the situation through proper channels, things might have gone very differently. Indeed, Frederick's attempt to kill James on the spot, in front of dozens of noble witnesses, had shocked even those loyal to Edward. When the king tried to restrain his son, Frederick's rage had turned on his father, revealing the depths of his instability. The ensuing chaos had allowed Rachel and the Guardians, who had infiltrated the palace staff, to free Elizabeth and create an escape route. The kingdom had awakened the next morning to unprecedented tumult. Edward dead by his son's hand, Frederick imprisoned by his own royal guard, and rumors spreading of a young man with the Blackwood birthmark who had miraculously survived the night of betrayal 25 years earlier. "The people chose you," Elizabeth reminded him, "even when you offered them other options." That much was true. In the weeks that followed, as nobles scrambled to pick sides and commoners held their breath, waiting to see if civil war would erupt, James had done something unexpected. Rather than immediately claiming the throne, he had called for a great council, a gathering of representatives from every region of Westoria to determine the kingdom's future. "You gave them a voice when they had been silenced for a generation," Rachel said, joining them on the balcony. Still preferring practical attire to court finery, the captain of the Royal Scouts wore a simple uniform with the silver falcon insignia. "That's why they chose you." The Great Council had been a risk, opening the possibility that Westoria might choose a form of governance beyond monarchy, or select a different noble line to rule. But it had also revealed how deeply the people yearned for the justice and compassion that had characterized Thomas and Eleanor's reign. When the council voted overwhelmingly to restore James to his father's throne, it came with a charter of rights that established limits on royal power and protections for citizens of all ranks. James had signed it willingly, believing, as his parents had, that a kingdom's strength lay in the well-being of all its people, not just the privileged few. "It's time," announced Lord Henry Taylor, who had risen from royal ally to Lord Chancellor. "In the new government, the delegation from Oakvale has arrived for the ceremony." James nodded, feeling a familiar tightening in his chest at the mention of his childhood home. The villagers of Oakvale had suffered greatly for sheltering him, though unwittingly. After his identity was revealed, Edward's forces had returned to the village, seeking information about the Guardian's network. Several buildings had been burned, including James's cottage and the village meeting hall. Among the first acts of James's reign had been the rebuilding of Oakvale and the other communities that had suffered under Edward's retribution. Today, representatives from these villages would receive formal recognition of their service to the crown, an acknowledgement long overdue. The delegation entered the royal reception chamber, led by a familiar figure, Sarah Turner, whose quick thinking had enabled James's escape that fateful night. Now serving as Oakvale's leader, she had overseen the village's transformation from a struggling farming community to a prosperous township. "Your Majesty," she greeted him with a formal bow, though her eyes held the warmth of their shared history. "Councillor Turner," James replied, matching her formality before breaking into a smile. "It's good to see you, Sarah." The ceremony proceeded with the dignity that had become characteristic of James's court, acknowledging sacrifice without glorifying suffering, celebrating resilience without minimizing loss. One by one, representatives from villages across Westoria received royal commendations and practical grants to support continued improvement of their communities. As the formal proceedings concluded, James invited the delegation to join him in the palace gardens for a less ceremonial conversation. Walking among the bloom-filled paths that Queen Eleanor had once tended, now restored to their former beauty, James found himself alongside old Thompson, who had somehow survived to see this day despite his advanced age. "Never thought I'd live long enough to stand in these gardens," the old man remarked, his voice weaker but his eyes still sharp. "Your great-grandfather planted these oak trees, they say?" James nodded. "So the royal gardener tells me. They've witnessed much of Westoria's history, both its darkest days and its brightest." "Like you have," Thompson observed. "The boy who grew up tending fields now tends a kingdom." "The skills aren't so different," James replied with a smile. "Patience, attention to conditions, concern for growth, planning for future harvests." They paused beneath the largest oak, its spreading branches providing welcome shade from the summer sun. "William would be proud," Thompson said quietly. "He raised you well for this, though he never spoke of it." James felt the familiar ache that came with mentions of the man who had been his father in all the ways that mattered. "I still miss his counsel. When facing difficult decisions, I often find myself wondering what William Miller would advise. And what would he say about your reign thus far? Thompson asked. James considered the question seriously. I think he would approve of the Charter of Rights and the regional councils. He always believed people should have a voice in matters that affected their lives. He smiled slightly. But he'd probably tell me the tax relief for farming communities should be more generous. Thompson laughed, a sound that turned into a slight cough. Aye, that sounds like William. As the garden reception continued, James circulated among the guests, speaking with each delegation. He had maintained this practice throughout his reign. Direct conversation with citizens from every region and rank, listening to concerns rather than merely issuing proclamations. Elizabeth found him later as the gathering was concluding. The Blackwood Forest representatives wished to speak with you privately, she informed him. Matthew Sullivan has a matter of some urgency. James followed her to a secluded corner of the garden where Matthew waited. The leader of the Crescent Guardians had aged considerably in 10 years, the responsibilities of rebuilding the forest. Communities after decades of isolation taking their toll. Your Majesty. Matthew greeted him with a bow that James immediately waved aside. None of that when we're speaking privately, Matthew. What's this urgent matter? Matthew's expression was grave. Our scouts report unusual activity in the northern baronies, secret gatherings, weapons stockpiling, messengers travelling between estates known to have been loyal to Edward. James frowned. Frederick's supporters? We believe so, Matthew confirmed, though Frederick himself remains secure in the island fortress. The former prince had been imprisoned rather than executed after his father's death, partly due to James's insistence that the new reign begin with justice rather than vengeance. Some had questioned this mercy, arguing that Frederick would remain a rallying point for those who opposed James's rule. Increase surveillance, but take no direct action yet, James decided. If they're planning something, let's understand the full scope before responding. As Matthew departed with his instructions, Elizabeth studied James's expression. You're not surprised by this news? Peace is never permanent, James replied. My father, King Thomas, believed that just rule makes rebellion less likely, but never impossible. There will always be those who prefer the old ways, who benefited from Edward's favoritism and resent the changes we've implemented. The regional councils, the tax reforms, the limitations on noble privileges, Elizabeth enumerated. You've challenged entrenched power throughout the kingdom, while creating new opportunities, James added. Trade has flourished, harvests have improved, more children receive education than ever before. He gazed across the garden to where the delegations were preparing to depart. But progress always faces resistance. As the sun began to set over Ravenhold, casting the white stone buildings in golden light, James returned to the palace balcony. Below, citizens continued their celebration, the atmosphere so different from the forced gaiety and underlying fear that had characterized Edward's festivals. Rachel joined him, her day's duties completed. The anniversary celebrations continue tomorrow with the regional athletic competitions, she reminded him. Your presence is expected at the opening ceremonies. James nodded. Another of my mother's traditions restored. Queen Eleanor had established competitions open to citizens of all ranks, believing that talent should be recognized regardless of birth. Edward had discontinued them, focusing instead on tournaments exclusively for nobility. You've rebuilt much in 10 years, Rachel observed. Yet looking out over the kingdom that had accepted him, not just as the heir to a bloodline, but as a leader whose vision they had chosen to follow, James felt a certainty that had eluded him during those first chaotic days after Edward's death. He was not just James Blackwood by birth. He was James Blackwood by choice. His own choice to accept the responsibility, and his people's choice to grant him their trust. The crescent birthmark might have identified his lineage, but his actions since returning to Ravenhold had defined his reign. A copper for your thoughts, Elizabeth said, joining him for a final time as the celebration began to wind down. James smiled. I was thinking about that night 10 years ago when a noblewoman collapsed outside a peasant's hut, and how neither of us could have imagined where that moment would lead. I had hopes, Elizabeth admitted, but even I couldn't have predicted how completely you would transform Westoria. There's still much to be done, James said, ever practical despite his royal position. Elizabeth nodded toward the city below, where citizens continued their genuine celebration. Perhaps. But tonight, take a moment to recognize what has already been accomplished. She placed a hand lightly on his arm. A kingdom where people no longer fear their ruler, but instead see the crown as their protector. That's a legacy worthy of the Blackwood name. As darkness settled fully over Ravenhold, the stars emerged above, the same stars that had guided James on his journey from Oakvale 10 years before. He had travelled from a farmer's field to a king's throne, from ignorance of his heritage to acceptance of his responsibility. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but standing here now, watching over the kingdom his parents had loved and died for, James knew with certainty that every step had led exactly where he was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.